When I was a kid, I lived with my grandma in an apartment complex in a very poor area. It was a really rough neighborhood, but my granny and I were living in the nicer part, which really isn't saying much. The apartment complex was pretty small, with 3 floors and 12 apartments in total. However, due to the unfriendly neighborhood, the neighbors weren't exactly friendly either. We hardly knew anyone in the complex. People were constantly moving in and out before you even had a chance to say hello. But then again, the few people we did greet were either creepy or involved in criminal activities. I don't think we were missing out on anything. The complex had a massive basement, and each apartment had its own storage room down there. The basement also housed the laundry facilities. The entire basement had an eerie atmosphere. It was really quiet down there, and even the slightest sound could be heard clearly. Any noise in the complex would reverberate into the basement. Additionally, the heater, also located in the basement, made sounds like a dying cat, and every pipe and floorboard creaked as if they were intentionally designed to do so. As a young child, my granny didn't allow me to go down there on my own, not that I ever wanted to. Even before this particular incident, a lot of unsettling things had happened down there. People often used the basement rooms for illegal activities or to store suspicious items. Many people moved away without cleaning out their rooms, leaving their belongings to be discovered by the landlord. Once, the landlord found a meth lab, and another time, a batch of dead dogs was discovered, apparently alive when the room's resident lived in the complex but left to starve once he moved out. Anyway, I was 14 when I was first allowed to go down to the basement on my own. My grandma was getting older, and I was taking on more responsibilities at home. Doing the laundry was always a nightmare for me because it meant going down to the basement. However, as time passed and I got used to the sounds and creaks, the basement became a bit less eerie. When I turned 15, my grandma won a new dining table set in a raffle. Being the old-fashioned hoarder she was, she didn't want to part with her old set and insisted on keeping it in our basement room. And of course, the task fell on me. I carried a few chairs down into our basement and then into our room. That's when I first heard the noise. What caught my attention was that it sounded unlike any of the usual noises down there. It had a repetitive, pattern-like quality that was distinct from the random sounds I was accustomed to. The noise was particularly pronounced in our room but wasn't audible outside of it. It was as if someone were knocking on the walls in the room next to ours. I pressed my ears against the wall, trying to determine its source. I remember thinking it might be rats or other pests scurrying within the walls. Then the pattern became even more apparent. 3 short knocks, 3 long knocks, 3 short knocks. I had a sudden feeling that I had heard this pattern before, but I couldn't quite recall where. I went back upstairs to my grandma and inquired about it. She reminded me that it was the Morse code for SOS, which she had taught me a long time ago. I mentioned hearing it in the basement, and she accompanied me to investigate. Upon hearing it herself, she called the police. The police arrived along with the landlord. They had each resident open their basement rooms. For the residents who weren't home or unavailable, their rooms were forcibly opened using a ram. In one of the rooms, the police found a large old-fashioned closet, resembling the one from the first Narnia movie. Inside, they discovered a young woman who had been abused, starved, and subjected to torture. The room's occupant was an elderly man living in the apartment above ours. It turned out that the woman had been trapped there for at least 5 days. While many others had apparently heard the noise, no one else recognized it as the SOS distress signal. I'm attending a small private college in the Midwestern United States. As a fine arts major, I spend many late nights in the art building. On this particular evening, several students were there along with one of my professors. I was planning to take some creepy photographs for an assignment in the building's basement. I had been there before, and it was essentially a long concrete storage area. I wasn't scared, but I did manage to persuade my friend Beth to join me. The staircase led down to a narrow rectangular structure divided into several rooms. We turned on all the lights, revealing stacks of artwork and old documents piled in every corner and crevice, with cobwebs draped over everything. At one point, we had to leave to help another student who was moving pottery. When we returned, the stairwell light was on, but the entire basement was pitch black. I was certain we had left all the lights on. I asked Beth, but she just mumbled a quiet, "I don't know." I assumed I had forgotten to leave them on. We were in a room about 40 feet long, positioned on the side farthest from the stairwell. Our only source of light was coming from a room on the far right. The white light spilled across the graffiti-covered wall I was planning to photograph. The back of the room featured a massive heating-cooling duct system that covered almost the entire wall, jutting about 5 feet into the room. Stacks of cardboard boxes and tools cluttered the area around it. To pass the time, I engaged in conversation. I half expected some grotesque art project gone wrong to leap out of the shadows. Around 20 minutes passed, and then we heard a faint sound coming from the stairwell. It sounded distant. I asked Beth if she had heard it, and she nodded. It resembled the sound of hands clapping together, but we were definitely the only two people down there. Despite the unease, I continued talking. Then we heard another sound. All conversation ceased. It sounded like someone dragging an object across the hard floor, similar to the sound of cardboard scraping against concrete. I stood up. The sound came from within the room, near the stairs. I wondered if it was an animal, but how could it have gotten down here? There was only one entrance. My eyes darted from side to side, scanning the darkness. Suddenly, without any warning, a small cardboard box shot out from behind the far end of the duct machine. It slid across the floor, and my stomach plummeted. It didn't roll as if it had fallen. It was propelled, pushed, or kicked with force. It emerged like a projectile. Something else was down there with us. I gripped Beth's arm and she stared at the box, her eyes wide with terror. Nobody else could have entered without us noticing. My logical brain screamed that fact, but what in the world had moved that damn box? My thoughts raced as I positioned myself with my back towards the only lit room. The light somehow felt safer. Do you want to leave? I heard Beth whisper. Was she serious? If you want to go, I'll go too. Although I appreciated her politeness, we couldn't just leave. The box was blocking the opposite door, our only escape route to the staircase and a light switch. There was no way I was going to walk past whatever had kicked it out there. I remained silent. I wasn't sure I could even speak. During that tense moment, we heard faint sounds from behind the large machine, like an impatient hand drumming on a metal desk. But soon it escalated to banging. The noise was so loud that it echoed and reverberated in the confined space. We had no idea what was happening or what to do. The constant noise enveloped us, yet we couldn't perceive anything in the darkness. It was incredibly frustrating, but somehow I found my voice. "Who the hell are you?" I managed to choke out. My attempt at intimidation was far from successful. "You better knock it the fuck off." My hands trembled. Then suddenly the noise changed, morphing into one of the most unsettling sounds I've ever heard. It wasn't just the sound itself that was disturbing. The ghastly screeching and scratching reverberated across the room. It was like nails on a chalkboard, and I recognized it. Fear seized me. Something sizable was crawling behind that cursed machine, and it was moving in our direction, rapidly. The noise was horrifying, akin to dragging a concrete block against a cheese grater, amplified 1,000-fold. Whatever it was, it struggled against the machine, scraping against the wall. It was as if a disfigured person was scrambling towards us, and it was closing in at a frightening speed. That was the most unnerving part. It moved with desperate urgency, pressing against the machine and scraping the wall. It sounded as though a tight fit was involved. We couldn't see anything. In my mind, I pictured a repulsive and grotesque figure inching towards us. Maybe they had hideous teeth, 5 legs, and a knife. Perhaps they had been lurking there for a while, and we had unwittingly disrupted their hiding place. The basement was rarely frequented, and routine checks were unheard of. Conceivably, someone could have been hiding there. Either way, I was certain they intended to attack. Nothing moves that quickly just to say hello. Adrenaline coursed through me, and Beth appeared ready to collapse from fear. I scanned the room for a weapon and spotted a grim-looking plunger. It might not have been the most elegant choice, but it was better than nothing. From the other end of the room, another noise echoed. It was unmistakably a cell phone striking the concrete floor. However, it wasn't either of ours. Instantly, my fear transformed into anger. A switch flipped within me. I knew who it was. My best friend, Carrie. "Carrie, you bitch. You dropped your fucking phone. Get out here so I can kick your ass." I was fuming. Adrenaline and anger weren't a great mix, especially not in this situation. I began to move, and just as I did, whoever had been lurking behind the machine leaped out right behind Beth and me. It was a short, stout figure, and their face eerily resembled a bleached pig, complete with beady red eyes. I quickly realized it was a disturbing mask. The person immediately sprinted towards us, and I stumbled backward, gasping. My fist was clenched, and I was poised to strike when I heard stifled laughter. Of all people, my professor emerged from among the boxes. I distinctly remember blurting out, "What the fuck?" I was utterly flabbergasted. Carrie sheepishly emerged from behind the machine, clutching her less than stellar phone. The masked sprinter was revealed to be another student. These idiots had spontaneously decided to prank us. Unfortunately, they succeeded. The pottery student and even the janitor were in on it, instructed to distract us while the others slipped downstairs. They turned off the lights, and I had passed their hiding spots multiple times. We were down there with them for nearly 10 minutes, thinking we were alone. Naturally, I demanded that they get the fuck out so I could finish my assignment. While I wasn't thrilled to see my friends, I was relieved it wasn't the alternative I had imagined. This happened when I was 5 or 6. My mom and dad were at work, so my 8-year-old brother and sister were watching me. We would always go down to the basement to play because it was really creepy, and they enjoyed it, even though I despised it due to its eerie nature. Every time I would go down there, I would always stay with my older siblings because, in my eyes, they were so cool and awesome. Anyway, we had finished playing and were ready to go upstairs to play the Rocket Power game on our GameCube when they ran ahead of me. The basement was always very dark and creepy. It was huge, and in the dead center were the stairs that led to the first floor. Right down the stairs was one of those small windows that showed the top of the grass. Well, my brother and sister ran ahead of me and locked the door before I could get out. As soon as it was shut, I could hear them laughing and saying things like, "Ha ha, we got you," and "You're trapped down there forever with all the ghosts that like to eat little kids." They found it hilarious, and because we were home alone, they could do this and not worry about getting in trouble. Anyway, as I'm banging on the door, sobbing, begging them to let me out, I look back and see a man crouched down, just staring at me from outside the window. His expression was completely blank. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. He had a ton of scars and cuts on his face, and he was incredibly thin with long black greasy hair. Thinking back, he was probably on meth. This only scared me more. I started screaming that there was a man at the window, but my brother and sister only laughed harder. We had one of those metal plates that you stick to the bottom of the door to keep your dog from scratching it. Well, my dog had scratched part of the metal down. As I'm banging on the door, I cut my knee open. I start screaming more, and then I turn back to see if the man was still there. He was. He looked at me, then at my profusely bleeding knee, then back at me, and then he just started laughing insanely. It was probably the sickest laugh I had ever heard, and once he opened his mouth, I could see he barely had any teeth whatsoever. His laugh was so sickening, it sent chills down my spine. I don't think there's even a way possible to explain this man's sound. I started screaming louder for them to go lock the door, but they only laughed louder. I could hear his laugh over my own screaming and my brother and sister. Eventually, they opened the door, saw that I was bleeding, and pulled the old, "Don't tell Dad," which we later had to. I lay down on the ground right outside the basement door. The window was still visible. The man watched for a second longer, with the same apathetic, cold, lifeless stare as before, then stood up and literally skipped away. I never saw him again, nor were there any reports in our neighborhood. I tried telling my family about this, but no one believed me. Though I did get something cool out of it. My knee ended up scarring, and often when I meet new people, they ask where it came from. I always get the pleasure of saying, "Well, you see, I used to be an adventurer, but then I took an arrow in the knee." It's a great way to get girls, and plus, battle scars are hot.